Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, it's time for another worst to best ranking. Okay, this series has dragged on a bit longer than I hoped to make it. But at long last, it is finally time to finish it off and has become more the tradition for finishing discography reviews. I am, of course, ranking all of their studio albums. The Orb do have 15 albums as of recording this. I'm not counting albums like Palma Fritz or See Better See. If you want to include those in your own rankings in the comments, feel free. So yeah, maybe those interested in looking more into these guys but don't feel like sitting through all the various videos I have done on them would want a more succinct guide on what to look for, and it's nice to have all my thoughts on the long career of this legendary ambient slash dub slash house slash techno outfit cemented in a relatively easy to digest fashion. So here we are. As per usual, disclaimers that this is just my opinion and you can feel free to disagree with it. These are only ranked based on which albums mean the most to me on a personal, purely subjective level. These guys have a ton of variety in their catalog, and certain albums often have very different subsets of defenders. Maybe you prefer the wilder and goofier side of their work. Maybe you prefer the Thomas Fellman-driven material that's a lot more focused and dignified. Maybe you only like their first 3 albums and think they fell off immediately after Chris Weston left. Obviously, everyone's gonna have very different takes on which Orb albums mean the most to them, and I can only speak for myself. I doubt my number 1 pick is going to be controversial at all, but anything else is a toss-up. Also, this ranking may not reflect how I feel in the future, either years from now if they release even more albums. I'm sure they will. Or maybe I'll second-guess myself immediately after uploading it, who knows. This ranking is obviously not set in stone or anything. But anyway, may as well get into it. This is The Orb, worst to best. And number 15, I have Bicycles and Tricycles.
Portable back garden.
I'll admit the bottom 3 picks of this ranking are very close personal enjoyment-wise. They've shifted around quite a bit, and I feel like they have very different strengths and weaknesses. It's one of the nice things about a band that's had so many different people contributing to it over the years. You'll get plenty of variety in sound and approach, and it'll nearly always be interesting. On the other hand, that variety is also one of the biggest weaknesses of Bicycles and Tricycles in particular. This album doesn't feel like it has any kind of unifying vision at all. It's just a random selection of loose tracks that don't tonally mesh well together, and even end up actively cutting into each other, getting stuff that ranges from playful and cheery, to dry and barren, to weird hip-hop crossover attempts that feel kinda out of character, to even 2 cuts that just kinda ape off their much more recognizable moments in earlier days. There are still a decent handful of solid tracks here. I'll always have a soft spot for The Land of Green Ginger, also really like G-Strings, Abstractions, and Hell's Kitchen. Even Aftermath is pretty good for what it is. And the presence of tracks like these that I still feel like I would see myself coming back to out of context did have me questioning whether this project truly deserved the bottom spot. But my enjoyment of all these tracks dries up quite a bit when I hear this thing in fuller context and hear how little rhyme or reason there is to anything and how astonishingly half-baked it is, especially compared to their previous run of fantastic projects. I will say people have told me that the Japanese version of this album, which puts the tracks in a different order, uses different versions of several tracks, and even throws in a couple of exclusive cuts, is the real definitive version, and far superior to the more widely available versions for the US or Europe. I haven't heard it to confirm for myself, since that would most likely require me to import a second CD copy. I've been told it's a lot better, at least. I guess I'll take people's word for it on that front, but I'm judging the UK version that is currently legally streamable on Bandcamp, and is most widely available to listen to. And a lot about that most popular version, it just gives me contractual obligation vibes, like a lot of the people involved just didn't have their heart put into what they were doing. It does have enough solid moments to still make it worth at least one listen. Definitely not a bad album by any stretch, but as a complete whole, it feels like the least passionate work in the Orb catalog, and that makes it hard to recommend going out of your way for. Whoopsh. And number 14, I have Baghdad Batteries. while this album has a hand up over Bicycles and Tricycles in that it does have a more cohesive vision behind it, if you're more of a Thomas Fellman fan, I can imagine it will be making a lot higher up in people's rankings, and I've certainly seen people defending it a lot more passionately. The Fellman-driven material has been more of an acquired taste for me that I found a lot more of a place in my life for recently than I did when I first heard this stuff as a teenager. But even so, for me, Baghdad Batteries remains the weakest of the Fellman-driven albums, and always felt like the Orb project that least showcased that particular Orb charm. Fellman's style does tend to fall a bit on the stodgy and stiff side, and while that can occasionally lead to some solid dub and techno grooves and mysterious oily ambience, it doesn't really feel like it's adding up to something all that substantial or striking here. Not to mention, while this project's first two-thirds are pretty decent, and the stretch from Dolly Unit to Orb and Tumbleweed particularly stands out as solid, it tanks really hard in its last third, starting with the track Pebbles and delivering a whole bunch of formless ambient cuts that are absolutely no fun, and have this odd sickly sweetness to them that comes off more stomach-churning than emotionally moving. Plastic Thrills is one of the worst things I've ever heard out of the Orb, ever. I do feel like I would get it if this album did really resonate with you, but I do feel like the other Fellman-driven albums either feel more striking and have bigger and more numerous standouts, or have more of an ambitious idea behind them. For me, this album is just kind of there, and I don't really come back to it often. And number 13, I have The Orbserver in the Star House.
Wanna hear it, hear it. I've got something.
Alright, now this was a weird one to pin down. On one hand, this is probably the Orb album I put on the least often. It has the least amount of standouts. I really like Bowl of Fire, but the rest of it doesn't really leave that strong an impression on me. Even both of the albums I have ranked below this one feel like they have more material I'd actually want to return to. But on the other hand, I also feel like the Orb really cared about this one and had their heart put into it way more than they did for the last two picks, since Dr. Alex and Fellman are clearly big longtime fans of Lee Scratch Perry and were super honored to have the chance to work with him directly. With how much dub reggae styles have played into the Orb style over the years, it does make perfect sense for there to be an album where they just decide to play that sound completely straight and basically just end up making a Lee Perry album. And that does hit harder, especially after Perry's passing last year. Now, I do think that kinda comes at the expense of having the music itself being as interesting as it could. The entire album relies very heavily on Perry's personality and the vocals, and the actual grooves they deliver for him are pretty dry and aren't much to write home about. If you took Perry out, you'd have almost nothing to latch on to. Ironically, I think they delivered a bit more in the little B-sides companion to this album, more Tales from the Orbservatory. They had a bit more distinct texture to their instrumentals on tracks like Foosball and No Ice Age and all those. Weird that it turned out a little stronger for me. But yeah, while the Orbserver album itself is probably the Orb project I find the least replayable, I do still really like the idea behind it, and that in itself prevents me from wanting to drop it further down the ranking. If you really like yourself some straight dub reggae, it's probably worth a shot. I just tended to lean more towards Orb albums that bring more of their own unique personality to the table, such as... And number 12, I have Abolition of the Royal Familia. Alright, we're at the part of the ranking that's definitively within good territory. This album and everything above it I still enjoy in its entirety, keep around, and come back to. Hell, this album got an 8 out of 10 for me when it first came out and ended up as an honorable mention on my year-end list for 2020. But oh boy, has time done weird things to my opinion on this one. In one breath, Abolition is definitely an Orb album that no other band would ever make. It's got plenty of variety, from dance-centric cuts to ambient cuts to dub cuts. There's plenty of texture, it's all very well produced. But some things started to feel off the more time I spent with it. At first I started to think that this album was kind of like lame and cheesy, you know, showing the goofier side of the Orb sound, which I typically have more of a preference for, but not doing it as well as previous attempts, and just not feeling as cool in the process. especially exacerbated by seeing the laughably cheap jib-jab-ish music video for the song Days. Not to mention that goofiness didn't really play well into an album whose title and album cover promised something a lot more serious and political, and just straight up turned out to not deliver that at all. Aside from maybe the closer, which, you know, it was cool at first. Predictive of the pandemic, you could say, but you really don't need to hear it more than once. But honestly, these complaints don't get in the way of my enjoyment that much anymore. If there's anything that really bothers me about this album now, it's the pacing. The thing about this album is that it kind of separates itself by genre. There's a section for dance music, a section for ambient music, a section for dub music, and then a bunch of other stuff at the end. That seemed like an interesting idea at first, but it does lead to this album feeling a lot more dragged out and lopsided than it needed to be. I liked it more when they balanced out all these ideas of the Orb sound and kind of sprinkled all of them throughout on an album like No Sounds Are Out of Bounds, instead of just like starkly isolating them like this. With that said, again, I still really like this album. The ambient stuff is very pretty and expansive, the dub material is as grooving as always, maybe a bit cheesier than usual. I really like the drum and bass experiments of Queen of Hearts and the emotional powerhouse The Weekend It Rained Forever. And easily the best part of all is the opening 4-track stretch with all these fantastic spacey disco cuts. They don't sound quite like anything else in the Orb catalog and are so instantly likable for me, especially when those string sections come in on tracks like House of Narcotics and Hawk Kings. Oh, it's so good. At the end of the day, Abolition is a very messy project that I tend to remember more for its missteps than its successes, and it's one that ended up kind of revealing to me why some people aren't as keen on this cheesier and sillier side of the Orb sound as I always have been. But anytime I actually put this thing on, I enjoy myself pretty much from start to finish. They can do a lot better, but it's still good. At number 11, I have COW/Chill Out World. Now, in contrast to Abolition, which I loved at first and then shrunk on me a whole bunch over time, here's an album which I wasn't really crazy about at first and then grew on me. It's another Thomas Feldman-driven project, and the most ambient-centric out of all of them. Hell, it's straight up just the most ambient-centric Orb album to date. There's not much in the way of like crazy samples or banging grooves. It's all doing its best to create this wide, expansive, naturalistic atmosphere. And at first I found the experience to be a bit too airy and not distinct enough to really stick with me, but especially as of late, I've really come to appreciate this one for how well it executes that laid-back sound it's going for. It's certainly not like there's any less texture than most Orb albums. It's just as well detailed in its sound as always, and even delivers more variety than I initially gave it credit for, with some tracks feeling a bit more like you're floating out in space, and others feeling like you're out in a vast open grass field in the summertime, but still obviously most concerned with feeling like a holistic and cohesive experience, without feeling like it's drifting too much into that overly stiff territory Feldman's ambient work can go. I also like how the title is a nice way to canonize the KLF's classic Chill Out album as a part of the Orb story. While this album is nowhere near as unique or well executed as that one, if Chill Out were part of the Orb catalog, it'd get ranked no lower than number 3. But this album certainly stands on its own outside of that project's legacy. I don't think this project is anything life-changing or has any of their strongest ever moments. I think they still have other projects that are much more attention-grabbing and interesting and feel more substantial. This album is a bit short, feels smaller scale than most Orb albums, but I do certainly feel warmer towards it than I did back when I reviewed it. As advertised, it's definitely a great album to chill out to. Whoopsh. At number 10, I have Okie Dokie, It's the Orban Compact. And now, welcome to the most Thomas Feldman-ish of any Orb album ever. So much so that many have described this album as a glorified Thomas Feldman solo album, including myself. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. I used to think that this led to a project that was markedly less interesting or well-textured compared to most Orb albums, and much like Baghdad Batteries, I thought it really fell off in its last third or so. But this album has grown on me a lot over the years. First of all, I do think Dr. Alex's zanier impulses do still show through just barely enough for this to still feel like an Orb album. there is more color and texture here than you'd hear on Feldman's actual solo albums. But even as subtle and stripped back as this album can be, I do think these compositions still manage to be pretty striking and memorable for what they are. While I couldn't really tell you off the top of my head what separates tracks on Chill Out World from each other, I can pretty easily remember what pretty much every track on this album sounds like and generally what it's going for. The techno-leaning cuts have really fun blocky grooves, like on Ripples, Captain Korma, Can Can, and especially Cool Harbor. The ambient-leaning cuts have pretty wild variety in terms of the energy they carry, be it the formless and intense but still foot-tapping and effortlessly cool blocky washes of Lunatic TM, the airy and expansive Traum vocal, the bucolic and peaceful Edelgrun, the dark and foreboding Compagna, among others. And the entire thing ended up doing well to make Feldman's style feel like a crucial part of the Orb style. He still has a very specific sound that you can't get elsewhere. The album's still admittedly not among their most consistent. There's a fair few cuts that kind of fall flat, like Complication or Snowbow. And it's still not my favorite Feldman-driven Orb album, but it is still quite solid. It's a heck of a lot better than I gave it credit for when I first heard it. Whoopsh. And number 9, I have Metallic Spheres. And now we're officially into the Orb albums on the border of great territory, although this one is a pretty dang weird and off-brand entrance into their catalog that sounds really different from anything else they've ever done. Collaborating with David Gilmour of Pink Floyd is not nearly as obvious a matchup as with Lee Scratch Perry, but that does mean their two styles work off each other in a much more interesting way, yet also complementing each other well enough that Gilmour ends up feeling like a full-on member of the Orb in the process. Gilmour bringing more of that trademark Floyd psych rock edge to their sound, but the Orb bringing him into more experimental territory than he'd ever explored on his own. At least not since, like, the early 70s. It is a very formless and meandering listen, what with having only 2 tracks, which both stretch on for over 20 minutes and are separated into 5 subsections each that don't have definitive start or end times. It's just kind of left up to the listener to guess, and some boundaries are easier to pin down than others. But obviously plenty of interesting things are going to happen in that time, and there's plenty of progression from sections that feel more open and ambient to other sections that have more of a banging rock or dub-influenced groove. And the final 8 minutes of this album, aka the Bull Knife Trophy section, is legitimately epic and one of the most hard-hitting moments in the Orb's history. Metallic Spheres is definitely a bit of an odd outlier in their catalog, and probably still more of a one-off curiosity than an absolutely essential part of their history, but this collab still goes over really well, and it's a really effective blend of their two very different styles, and it's exactly as fun to listen to as you would want it to be. Whoopsh. And number 8, I have Orblivion. Alright, this is the first Orb album to not feature Chris Weston as a full-time member and saw him replaced with Andy Hughes. Some people consider this the end of the Orb's classic period as a result, but if you ask me, if I didn't already know that such a key member was gone, I don't think I would have suspected anything. I think this is still the band very much in their prime and delivering a prototypical experience that you couldn't mistake for anyone else. I do think the album is a fair bit spottier than previous classics. I think the album's opening stretch, while just as well textured as you want, can feel pretty formless and run together, and some moments hit way more for me than others, especially the eternally classic banger Toxigene and the absolutely gorgeous Molten Love. But at the same time, I do still think this is a great album that comes together pretty cohesively, all things considered. There is definitely a vibe to this album that sets it apart from their other material from this era. It's a lot darker and more pessimistic, but still just as hyper-detailed, immersive, and alien-sounding as the Orb's best material can be. Some people have even told me that it's their favorite Orb album, even above the obvious one, and I think that's a fair pick to make. On a personal level, though, I think they have a bunch of others that come together as a whole even better and are even more consistent. Such as... Whoopsh. And number 7, I have Moon Building 2703 AD. Right, now this was one of the first albums I ever reviewed, way back around the time when it came out in 2015. and I found all my videos from that era to be borderline unwatchable. But I remember being so excited by this project when it first came out, citing the strong balance between the strengths of both Alex Patterson and Thomas Feldman's usual styles, and how it pushed them into new territory that no previous Orb album had ever gone into before, but still exemplified the core appeal of their best work. And yeah, pretty much entirely stand by that to this day. Moon Building is still a one-of-a-kind experience and easily my favorite of all the Feldman-driven albums. It does still absolutely stick to Feldman's production style, and as such won't be quite as lively or colorful as a lot of their classic work, leaning a lot more on the subtle side of the Orb sound and focusing on long-form pieces that firmly stick to repetitive and blocky dub techno grooves the whole way through. I've seen people mention they think this one was a bit of a tedious slog for them and preferred the more individually striking ideas of Okie Dokie or the prettier ambience of Chill Out World. I feel like I can understand that perspective, but I still think this album sounds so freaking cool. I love how each of these 4 tracks feels like they slowly evolve and change form over time, and the journey they take you on. I think they perfectly fit the concept of feeling like you're on the surface of the moon and exploring all the strange barren landscapes. I like how each of these 4 tracks feel like they add up so cohesively to the same experience, but each one feels distinct in their own odd way, like movements of a symphony. And especially love the title track and how even more groove-centric it is and how it dips its toes into jazz and disco territory. This is absolutely a big late period gem for the Orb, and marks the beginning of a sort of second win for their career where they started to see a little more consistent critical acclaim than they had in quite a while. And somehow it's still not quite my favorite of these later period Orb projects. That honor goes to... whoosh. At number 6, I have No Sounds Are Out of Bounds. Okay, I don't imagine most people are going to have this album as high in the ranking as I do, but I've always had more of a preference towards the goofier and poppier side of the Orb. And I loved how this album feels like a combination of every single sound the Orb have explored over all their decades of existence. There's bright vocal pop with dub textures in The End of the End and Rush Hill Road. There's uplifting spacey techno with Pillow Fight at Shag Mountain and a silly but heavy dub banger, Wish I Had a Pretty Dog. And there's a mildly embarrassing meme fest in Wolfbane. But the album manages to balance all these more lighthearted sounds with their more serious side as well. There's 2 Thomas Feldman cuts in Isle of Horns and Other Blue Worlds that reprise the subtle beauty of moon building. There's the existential dread of Donuts Forever and deep ambient dub melancholy of Easy on the Onions and United States, all driven by excellent piano performances from Roger Eno. And of course there's the fantastic 15-minute epic to close us out in Soul Planet, which has all the spacey expansiveness you'd want out of an Orb track of that scale, and fittingly combined with excellent soulful vocal performances from Andy Kane and Mary Pierce. You'd think with how all over the place this album is sonically, it wouldn't really come together as a whole as effectively, and okay, I'm not sure how well it does either, but they did kind of warn you with the title. Still, every individual moment on here feels like everyone involved was bringing their A game, and is paced in that perfect way to never feel boring or feel like these styles clash with each other. Anytime I feel like it's ready for a change up in sound, it'll have one. There isn't a single weak track in the bunch, even Wolfbane for how much of a mildly cringe head scratcher it is. It still feels like it works from a sequencing standpoint. It's just the right out-of-nowhere what-the-fuck moment the album needed to break up 2 fairly barren Feldman landscapes. No Sounds Are Out of Bounds isn't going to be everyone's cup of tea, especially as a complete whole, but for me, it all totally holds up and is perfect fan service for my years of investment in the long history of this band and love for the kookier side of their sound. So, I continue to hold it close to me. Whoopsh. At number 5, I have UF Orb. Okay, now here we got one of the big obvious classics, what I believe was the Orb's most commercially successful project upon its release. This is another one that I can easily see people marking as their personal favorite Orb album overall. Some people have mentioned to me that they found the shorter running time of this album compared to their debut, and the slightly wider variety of styles and sounds to be easier to get into, and end up as a more accessible starting point. And I can definitely see that. I personally have my issues with this project that prevent it from hitting as well as it could, mostly pacing and sequencing related. I think OOBE is a bit of a weird, unindicative start to the project, even if its atmosphere, which feels like being lost in zero gravity with no points of reference, has been a major grower as of late. And I think Majestic, while a fun peppy tune with plenty of energetic bounce that doesn't get old over 11 minutes, doesn't feel like the strongest of closers either. Maybe if you moved the opener to the end and started with the title track instead, that might work better, I don't know. But at the same time, I love the title track and how it slowly builds up and pays off in this kick-ass techno banger. I love Blue Room's evolutions from peaceful, watery ambience into progressively more mechanical and stranger sounds, and eventually also paying off really well into a deep dub techno groove at the end. Close Encounters is one of the most propulsive and fun techno cuts the Orb have in their catalog, and my personal favorite, Towers of Dub, has quite possibly the best groove of any dub reggae track I've ever heard, and really opened up my mind to what one could do within this style, while still feeling respectful of the long tradition of dub reggae music in the past. This is still an absolutely fantastic album, and every track has become a big iconic Orb staple, and all of it still very much holds up. I just personally wished it flowed better as a whole, and that meant a few other albums in their catalog ended up getting higher billing, including what is almost certainly going to be my most controversial placement of all. Whoopsh. At number 4, I have Cydonia. Yeah, this album has the reputation of being a career killer for the Orb, the point at which they, for whatever reason, decided to incorporate vocal pop and trip hop elements, and the fans were so thrown off that many of them decided to jump ship. But just as I've made it clear many times, I do not think Cydonia deserves such a reputation. I think it is just as complete and well developed as all of the Orb's previous classics. The incorporation of the pop vocals as seen on tracks like Once More, Ghost Dancing, Centuries, and Plum Island, I can see why they might have been a turnoff for fans at the time, but I think they're all really well implemented and fit surprisingly naturally into the Orb's spacey sound, even if it'd be easy to write off as like, oh, they're just label concessions. I think Dr. Alex was happy to go in a poppier direction and was interested in the new boundaries he might cross. It all feels totally genuine, and he ends up having the tunes to back himself up. Still absolutely love Once More, I don't care. And of course there's still plenty of goofy weirdness and expansive ambient landscapes that you'd want out of an Orb album from this era. Tracks like Promise, Hamlet of Kings, and Terminus feel like you're being transported into this blissful alien fairy tale universe. But there's also more foreboding and mechanical bangers like Turn It Down, EDM, and A Mile Long Lump of Lard, and totally off-the-chain moments like Thursday's Keeper, or even the interludes like Ignable and Firestar, which I would not want removed either. This is an album that really feels like it's taking me on a journey through some alternate alien universe, just like all the big classic Orb albums, and goes through a coherent arc and is well-paced and sequenced, even if it doesn't take itself as seriously as some other projects of theirs. If you hate it, I mean, I guess I kinda get it. That's your loss. But I love this album and always have ever since the first time I heard it. I think it's starting to get a bit of a reappraisal, especially among the Orb's younger fans like myself, and I'm glad to see that. But getting back to some of the more obvious picks. Whoopsh. At number 3, I have Orbis Terrarum. Now, of course, this album means something special to me since it was literally the first Orb album I heard way back in my, I think, middle school days. I really liked the little fluffy clouds and wanted to get into the Orb more since they had a similar name to Orbital. I checked this CD out from the library since it was the only album by the Orb they had a copy of. And at the time, I did not get it at all. I thought it was a boring, overlong slog, and I didn't revisit it again until several years later when I developed more of a taste for ambient music, when it immediately clicked a lot more and finally gave me the push for me to get into all of their other work and for the Orb to end up becoming one of my favorite bands. Now, in retrospect, if you're not already into ambient music, this album is probably not a great starting point for those looking to get into the Orb for the first time. What with it probably being their single most experimental and free-flowing project to this day. But that's exactly what I most love about it now. This album sets itself apart from their other space-themed projects by feeling like it's grounded on Earth, but reminds you that you don't need to leave Earth to feel like you've entered into another world. Feels like you're being taken over all these vast natural landscapes, tracks that use their monstrous lengths to feel just as huge and sprawling as they look, even in spite of not always having a lot of progression over time. Well, that of course depends on the track. Moments like Valley and Plateau feel like you're driving over mountain pathways and through bright green fields. They feel like you're stuck in like one blissful moment the entire time. Or White River Junction, which feels like you're overlooking a giant river dam and being treated to the ebbing and flowing of both the water and the machinery. While other moments, like Oxbow Lakes and Occidental, start out fairly accessible sounding with bright pianos and bubbling, banging beats, respectively, before getting weirder and more unhinged and losing any semblance of structure as they go on. And of course, the centerpiece of sorts, Montagne d'Or, being one of the most epic tracks the Orb ever made, starting out fairly low-key and peaceful, but slowly transitioning into a loud, blaring banger by the end. Absolutely fantastic. If I do have to nitpick, the final track, Slug Dub, isn't the most impactful of closers. Most of the dub grooves through that one aren't really that memorable, although the samples of some children's story in which slugs terrorize a family's garden can certainly make up for that. You're never gonna forget those once you've heard them. Still, absolutely fantastic album. A good send-off to the era of Chris Weston being in the band. And one that was a pivotal moment in developing my personal taste in ambient music. But as much as this album means to me, there's still two more that I hold even closer. And number 2, I have The Dream. The Dream isn't just one of my favorite Orb albums, it's one of my favorite albums of all time, full stop, regardless of genre. Ever since I first heard it, I was so instantly taken by the constant sense of wild imagination throughout every single second, through every track, from the over-the-top pop vocal hooks, which always easily stuck in my head, to the more abstract down-tempo leaning cuts in the back half, to the crazy sound design which felt so dense and multi-layered and filled with goofy vocal samples saying random shit. There's not a single moment throughout this album's 70-plus minutes where my attention is lost or there isn't some fun new detail to notice. It's the album where Dr. Alex Patterson's presence in particular feels like it's the most important than it was on any other album, thanks to all the random sampling. But the sheer density of the sound design never feels like it takes a backseat to making the songs themselves good. Every track is easily memorable, has fantastic grooves and bass lines and melodies and ambience, and all of it is perfectly well balanced from a production standpoint, taking influence from the high detail and weird but commercial and polished sound explored on the Orb side project Transit Kings. Check their album out too, by the way, it's really freaking good. I've always been in awe at this album. It's perfectly fine-tuned to my ADHD brain and the way I like to digest music. Granted, I'm also aware that my love for this album in particular is not a particularly common take among Orb fans. I kinda mentioned how Cydonia is such a controversial entrance in their catalog thanks to its incorporation of pop vocal features. While The Dream isn't quite that level of controversial, it doesn't have quite the same career killer reputation, it's also one the fan base tends to be kinda divided on. Some people prefer, the more subtle and stripped back approach the Fellman stuff goes for, and Fellman is completely absent here. So you may find the over-the-top silliness of this project and all the incessant vocals to be a major turnoff. You may find the entire experience to be massively cheesy, or even stupid. I do understand that it absolutely won't be for everyone. A lot of this album feels random and wacky for its own sake, without really ascribing any deeper meaning or concept to it. But that's also kind of the appeal for me. It's an album that, true to the title, seems to follow dream logic, where everything happens in a random haze, and none of it makes logical sense, but it still feels real anyway. And again, it's the kind of project that no one but the Orb could ever possibly come up with, even if it's still, they don't really have any other albums that sound quite like it either. I think it's an absolute masterwork, but it's still only at number 2 in the ranking, which will finally take us to the top pick, which I think the fans can agree on a lot more unanimously than they can on this one. At number 1, I have The Orb's Adventures Beyond the Ultraworld.
Reconocimiento 2000.
Yes, shocking, I know. But, yes, Adventures Beyond the Ultraworld is an album that feels like it goes beyond words. This is an album that starts small and simple, grounded on Earth, but takes off out past the moon and into the outer reaches of the galaxy, jumping through wormholes, perhaps visiting alien planets, and leaving you in awe at the vastness of the universe as we know it. There's not a single track that hasn't become an all-time Orb classic, from the ever-iconic Little Fluffy Clouds, which started life as a quick one-off shitpost about Ricky Lee Jones sounding like she's on drugs in one interview, and ended up as the Orb signature track that they close their live sets with, like big epic 10-minute versions of. To the closer, a huge ever-growing pulsating brain that rolls from the center of the Ultraworld. The single that first put them on the map in an impressively huge 18-minute jam of synth arpeggios and samples. To all the journeys in between, the isolated spaciness of Supernova at the End of the Universe and Backside of the Moon. The classic dub bangers Perpetual Dawn and Outlands, the gritty epicness of Earth Gaia, the peaceful meditations of Spanish Castles in Space and Star 6 and 789. And don't even get me started on all the epic progressions of Into the Fourth Dimension. This album was nothing short of a life-changing event for me when I first heard it. You could complain about the simplicity of these compositions and how most of these tracks basically focus on the same sounds throughout their whole running time, but that's kind of just the norm for the Orb, and they made all of these tracks so immediately alluring that you could get into them right away and not get sick of the sounds they explore through their entire running times. Maybe other people can find other Orb albums that resonate with them more strongly, or they feel more personal to them. But I think this is the one that most effectively combines the strengths of everyone who's ever been involved. Patterson, Weston, Fellman, Youth, System 7, Jimmy Cauty, everyone else applicable, and gets all their styles to mesh perfectly together. It's the one most obvious starting point for anyone looking to get into the Orb for the first time and wants to know what they're all about. It's obviously so well celebrated already, not even to get into the various live versions out there, some of which may be improvements on the originals even for me. Remix albums like the Aubrey mixes, the shorter video companion subtitled Patterns and Textures, all of which fans could have an even stronger attachment to than the original album, and have mentioned to me that they do. But as a full experience, for me, nothing's going to beat the original in my eyes. I saw a comment on AllMusic that called this album the 2001 A Space Odyssey of house records, because it may be very slow-paced, but it tackles such weighty cosmic ideas that require that pacing and could leave you breathless by the end. And I think that parallel pretty well sums it up. You can think it's overrated if you want, but there's a reason this album captured so many people at the time and still gets talked about 30 years later. Truly, there's nothing else in the world or the universe quite like it. And that's the entire Orb ranking. We're done with this series. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself that list. A link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.